Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this video today is we're going to be looking at common mistakes that a lot of students will make in their essay writing. And basically what we're going to go through is trying to basically go through all those mistakes to try and make sure that you don't make the same ones in your essay writing. Okay, so, and most of these are very easily remedied as well. So I'm not going to go so much into things like grammar and spelling so much, because those are things which will take practice and really effort on your half to eliminate from your writing. And basically requires a lot of practice and a lot of writing particularly to ensure that you can get out of the habit of doing those things. What we'll go through is just some simple solutions to the ones that are easily remedied, and basically to go through some strategies to make sure that you have the right kind of mindset for writing an essay. Okay, so the first mistake that quite often I see is informal writing. And basically, in an essay, it is inappropriate virtually at all times to write in informal. And the main reason for this is that informal terms are often indefinite, which basically means it's assumed knowledge or assumed meaning, which means that a lot of informal writing refers to things like cultural language, which is all well and good if you are speaking to someone here. But if you're speaking to someone overseas who doesn't quite understand the way that we talk, it's very, very difficult for them to pick up what it is you're talking about. Or it goes into the sorts of vague details, which you often do when you're speaking conversationally, and doesn't really talk about things specifically, which could basically make your argument a lot better anyway. So for instance, writing, "or that's just the way it goes," that doesn't really have any specific meaning. So you need to actually replace that with some sort of specific detail and go, okay, well, what does that mean? I mean, if I read that and go, "that's just the way it goes," what goes? So by finding more specific details that you can use, as in you talk about a language technique or you talk about a reason which is developed in a text, then you're actually going into much more detail than just simply saying, "oh, that's it, yeah, that's all right." So really just try and think about having some more specific details, using things basically what's called the Queen's English, which basically means English by all of its rules and by all of the ways that basically you see written in academic language and in textbooks. So if you have a look at your textbooks for your different subjects, most of those will be written in formal English. And the reason for that is not just so they can be proper school books, but because of the fact that it gives you specific information, which means that you can refer to them and you can use those books as a resource rather than something that someone's just said, which is mostly true, but has these little vague points which are very hard to get. So by writing in that sort of style, you're basically making sure that everyone can understand that everything that you're writing is true, and that basically the way that you're putting your answer together is airtight and it's much stronger. Okay. The second thing is needless complication. So basically you don't need to come up with massive overcomplicated arguments. And simply the easiest way to reduce this is to reduce the wording, or basically just simplify the language used. You don't have to come up with massive amounts of really complicated vocabulary that you've got off a calendar, a word of a day calendar. You can basically use just very, very simple language in order to get your point across. You should be trying to develop sophistication instead, rather than necessarily trying to throw a thesaurus at a marker, which is often what we call it. And basically what that often entails is that students, when they're writing an essay on their computers, will hit thesaurus. What happens? They come up with a word that completely makes no sense, and when I'm marking it, I'm going, hang on, why have you used that word? And I realise, oh, you've just used a thesaurus. So by adding more complicated language, it doesn't really impress any marker that I've come across, and particularly it doesn't impress me when I'm marking work. So just use very simple, as not really overly simple. You don't have to use language that you're using in primary school, for instance, but just to simplify it, so you're just really focusing more on just communicating your ideas rather than necessarily trying to write with really expansive vocabulary. That's the main point of this exercise. All right, now discussion and evidence. Using evidence in isolation is pointless. So, for example, the theme of death is communicated in the text Destiny, and with a touch of his blade she fell. Now you think, well, that might make sense. But the thing is, this is not connected to this in really any sort of way. Now, the evidence and the idea can go together. I'm not saying they can't. And in fact, this would be a perfectly valid quote from the story in order to support this statement. But what you need to do is basically explain, okay, how does this touch of a blade nonsense talk about death? That's how you develop, and that's how you basically link the two together. So you would say it is proven through this statement because of the fact that there is this preoccupation with death and destruction through this character's sword, or whatever the story has in its context. So basically you can start to link that more strongly together. Just putting the quote there doesn't make it true. So you need to actually prove that this matches up with this. Alright, the next thing is basically undeveloped arguments, and this is probably one of the more common things that I see, and one of the things you really should be careful of, which is arguments or main points that you have need to be developed. So there are a couple of ways, and I'll just go through each one and give you some examples. So first of all is not elaborating on a main point, main introduction. So if you say that this essay is essentially going to be talking about this, you need to make sure your essay is talking about it. I've come across a number of essays when I'm marking them, which basically have all these ideas in the topic sentence, which they don't discuss at all in their response. So you need to make sure that if you put something in your introduction, that you talk about it. So, and particularly, your introduction should be very simple ideas, which are ready to be developed, not necessarily a sharp and witty introduction. So make sure that anything that you put in your introduction is developed in such a way that you're proving it, you're discussing it, you're talking about it. Your introduction is basically just that. It's to talk about all the things you're going to raise and elaborate on in your response. Not necessarily a big, dramatic, creative thing where you're impressing people with your knowledge and your general aptitude and things. You're talking about what it is you're writing about in your essay. Next thing is basically failing to properly develop a topic sentence. So you start a sentence or a paragraph with a topic sentence, and then basically you don't really talk about that topic sentence again. So you start off with an idea at the beginning of a paragraph, and then you talk about something else completely. So really, not only do those two things not match, and you've really got two arguments in the same paragraph, but basically you're not developing your topic sentence and proving it in any way. And that adds to confusion, because if you've got that right at the beginning and then you start talking about something else, immediately your marker's going, why are you doing that? Why not talk about the thing you just raised in your opening sentence? So failing to properly develop it or properly explain it is another thing that particularly comes across as an undeveloped argument. Now, the next thing is basically not developing any sort of main point effectively, which means if you start off with your first paragraph as your big main point and you only go on with it for a paragraph, and then you spend everything else, your rest of your essay, talking about other things which aren't really related, that's not really developing your main points effectively. So you need to have your main points developed in such a way, and basically you're going through them in as much detail as you can, or as much detail which is reasonable within the time frame and the word limits that you have, and developing them in such a way that you are really elaborating, expanding, and really satisfying the criteria of developing your main point. So you're using critical analysis, you're using higher order skills, you're interpreting everything, you're really making sure that you have a full, concrete response to the question, which is a lot more airtight than if you just leave it open for interpretation. It's not a marker's job to interpret what you're trying to write. It's your job to interpret things and then to prove it in such a way that a marker can look at it and go, okay, yes, you've done that. So that's the big thing. You need to make sure that it's not just common sense that we link these two things together. You've got to prove it to us. All right, next thing, poor links to the question. Now, it's one thing to write a really great essay, but it actually needs to really answer a question. It needs to link to it. So the one thing you need to do to make sure that it links to the question is make sure you check it thoroughly. Make sure you actually go through the process of understanding the question and developing it in such a way that you are linking back to it. I mean, it's all well and good to have a great essay, but if it's not really responding to the question, then there's no point in writing it. It's also the reason basically preparing essay responses in advance before an exam will fail, and quite often. So you really need to focus on the question, because that is basically the heart and soul of everything you're trying to achieve in essay writing, is answering questions. It's not there as a torture exercise. It's not there to fill 6 pages and to give English teachers something to do at night. It is there to basically ensure that you can understand and you can show your understanding in your assessments, in your exams, of the content and the curriculum that you're being taught. So that is what you're doing in an essay. You are answering a question, so you need to actually make sure it does that. Okay, so essays which waffle are another common fault which basically come across in a lot of English essays that I particularly mark, but also is quite a common fault from a lot of writing. And basically what that means is they're either too vague or they just go on to things which aren't really relevant. Now, what that basically means is you're wasting your time. If you've got things that are vague or relevant or just waffle on about nothing, you're not answering a question, you're not really addressing any of the criteria, and you're not doing anything that you can be really marked on. So it's something that you really, the only time you want to be seeing waffle is somewhere around the dinner table. You don't want to be seeing it anywhere else. Now, the best way to avoid this sort of waffle is to constantly evaluate what it is you're writing, which basically you have to ask yourself this question: is what I'm writing matching what I'm trying to do? Now, by asking that question, and you ask yourself that question as you go, when you're going back and checking your work, you're basically saying, okay, is this writing actually going anywhere? Am I answering a question by doing this? So that will basically stop you just getting into that adrenaline-filled mayhem, which often happens, and I understand that completely, how basically when you're writing, the adrenaline kicks in and you start just writing whatever comes to the top of your mind, and you're surprised how easy it comes across. But really, usually what happens in that case is you just go on and you forget about even answering things like the question or just by doing the basics. So you need to just ask yourself that question every so often. Just practice going through in your head, am I answering a question? Am I answering a question? Am I answering a question? And then you'll find that your waffling will basically grind down a little bit. So it's something that's really easy, and it's a very simple process just to go back and do that in your head every so often. And it will save yourself not only a lot of time writing it, but it will save your markers a lot of headaches trying to mark it and interpret what it is you're trying to write. So it makes it much clearer, it makes your argument a lot more refined, and essentially it saves you a lot of time and effort as well, which would be just wasted otherwise. So rather than breaking your wrist trying to write as much as you can, try and make sure that it is directed towards something and not just there because you need to fill up 6 pages. And that's basically it. So those are the common mistakes for essay writing. So just make sure that when you go back over your work, that you constantly evaluate and you set yourself some standards and you are critical of your own work. So you don't necessarily rely on a teacher to go, you've done this poorly or done this well. You go back and you set yourself your own standards, and then through those standards, you basically can, with feedback from your teachers, work on ways that you can set yourself targets for things that you want to be able to achieve in your essay writing, and write in such a way that you are basically doing what you think is your best possible work every time. And mainly, the thing you're trying to do is you're trying to develop your points in such a way which are coherent, and you're trying to structure an argument. If you're doing one of those things where you're not really thinking ahead and you're not really planning, then this is where a lot of these common mistakes creep in. So otherwise, just remember those simple rules, go back over your work, be critical of your own work, but don't be too hard obviously on yourself. Don't try and criticize everything you do, but just set yourself some standards which are achievable, which allow you to get the best you can out of yourself without going overboard and being overly finicky or overly critical of yourself. And just make sure that you can produce your best work when you need to. But otherwise, that's about it for common mistakes for essay writing. Until next time, I'll see you later.